So nothing like starting a webinar with a pop quiz. I'm going to give you guys a pop quiz. Here are a series of safe terms that probably are very familiar to most of you on this call. And my first question is, have you ever seen any of these terms in an Agile tool? And I'm willing to bet money that the virtual show of hands is yes. My second question is, have you ever seen any of these terms in a requirements management tool? And I'm willing to bet money that most people are saying, in fact, no. And so really, that's the moment. That is a core fundamental disconnect. So what do you do about that? And really, that's what today's webinar is all about. Why is this the case? Why should I care? And how do I overcome this fundamental disconnect? And I'm really going to start out by talking about why you need to care. And I bet some of you are saying to yourselves, hold on a second. We're talking about SAFe. Why are you bringing up requirements management? And hence the title of this webinar isn't requirements management and Agile an oxymoron. And it's perceived to be that, but actually I would argue that that's not really the case at all. It's a reality, because scaled by definition equals big, and big often equals regulated or mission critical. And so I just spent a little bit of time thinking to myself things like, I'd love to watch you describe to an auditor that the user story that was, implemented for the automatic brake system for the car, it's just gone now because that sprint's over. Or I'd love to watch all of your systems engineers when you tell them, just use Jira stories for the specs for the propulsion engine. And I'd love to watch the team recreate all of the user stories necessary to implement accessibility every time a new application needs to get built for a pharmaceuticals company. So I would argue that for many organizations, your safe implementation will simply have to include requirements management tools. And I'll digress for just a moment. Again, when you think about SAFe, there are a lot of components to it, and there's really no way to implement a significant implementation of SAFe without recognizing that there are multiple disciplines involved, and thus multiple tools. And essentially, if you take a step back from that, if that's going to be the case, there's no way to implement SAFe without understanding the flow of information between these tools. So now you know why you should care, because as we've described, it's highly likely that if you're doing SAFe, you will need both Agile management and requirements management tools. And one thing I'd like to just take a step back and address, and certainly as since Sarah did mention the year 2001, which is indicative of how long I've been around, there is, I believe, also another misconception that requirements management is old school. In fact, I've actually been very impressed with what I've seen in requirements management tools in the last 5 years. And so this isn't about old versus new. This is about making the reality of, maybe I should call them Agile requirements management tools, bringing them into the fold as kind of a first-class citizen. So back to the story here. Let's explore a little bit more about why requirements management tools don't have all of the common SAFe concepts like backlogs and sprints that we talked about as part of the pop quiz. So one of the reasons is that requirements management is a much older discipline than Agile. That's absolutely true. But don't be deceived. That is not really the most important. That's not really the most important reason. Fundamentally, requirements management is about defining, and Agile management is primarily about doing. And that, at the core, is probably the most important thing to recognize between these two disciplines: defining versus doing. And we're gonna talk more about that in the course of this session. Okay, so now you know why you need to care. You need to care because you're likely going to need requirements management if you're scaling. And we also now understand why requirements management just don't have the same concepts as Agile, because defining is fundamentally different and requires different concepts than doing. Well, that's great, but of course the natural follow-on question then is how do I overcome this fundamental disconnect? I don't know if any of you have ever attended any of my other webinars, but I have a common theme. I tend to find a way to bring marriage into just about every webinar that I give, because there are so many common aspects. It really is understanding this fundamental disconnect and how you overcome it is quite a bit like a marriage. So first, you need to stay true to the basics of what each person brings into the relationship. Respect the fact that a requirements management tool is there for a different reason than an Agile management tool. And there will be some struggles that will take a lot of solid communicating to overcome. It won't be perfect, but it gets better over time. So now that we're done with our little marriage counseling session, let's explore more about this fundamental disconnect. So basically, you have to go back and think about the fact that fundamentally, every software delivery tool, whether it's requirements management, test management, Agile management, you name it, they basically, every tool has two primary components. Work items, of which the primary goal of work items is to hold information about work to be done, and containers. And containers, the primary goal is to group things together for some purpose. And it's really about understanding that containers' underlying purpose that will form the basis of a successful marriage between requirements management and Agile management. And at this point, I always like to note that there's a strong tendency to only focus on artifacts, right? Requirements, features, epics, stories, defects. But it's really equally important. It's equally important that we focus, when you're thinking about flow of information between tools, that you focus on the containers. And I feel compelled as I was putting this together and I saw this graphic. As I said, I live in Austin, and I feel compelled to show everyone the fact that Austin actually has a container bar. And no, I'm not kidding. This is a real picture of it. So if any of you attendees happen to live in Austin, I would love to meet someone at the container bar to talk about containment. It's in a very cool part of town, although it's full of people much younger than I am. But anyway, so back to our story. So let's talk and learn a little bit more about containers. There's really three different types of containers: scheduling containers, organizing containers, and aggregating containers. I'm not going to talk really at all today about aggregating containers, and really that's a topic that is, at least in my mind, a little bit unclear, the role of if aggregating containers are a separate container type or if they're actually somewhat orthogonal to that. But in no uncertain terms, there are scheduling containers versus organizing containers. And so if you actually take a step back and look, I'm showing here a series of different tools. And I certainly recognize that different tools kind of aren't just Agile or just requirements, but I've kind of categorized these kind of where they sit. And what you notice is that the Agile management tools tend to be heavy on scheduling containers, and as you see, quite light on organizing containers. Whereas you find the opposite with requirements management tools, light on scheduling, on scheduling, and heavy on organizing. And if you go, I will quickly show you, that's just one. There's many more tools, and it's very interesting to note that kind of pattern, if you will. And we really, and I'm not going to talk about the aggregating part, and we really are, now we understand why this is the case, right? Because Agile management tools are primarily about doing, and doing is really about scheduling. Whereas requirements management tools are really about, they're really about defining, which is largely about organizing. So in order to address this kind of fundamental disconnect, the first thing you have to do is think about purpose. Why are you using a requirements management tool? Is it primarily for the purpose of reuse of requirements? Is it primarily for the purpose of compliance and audit trails? Is it because you want those the additional types of features that often requirements management tools have around storyboarding and diagramming? Is it a little bit of both? And I thought it would be helpful just to give you a couple examples when you think about the purpose of why you're doing requirements management. So compliance and audit example. So I want one grouping for all the requirements for my jet propulsion engine, another grouping for the radar system requirements. And I want both of these to be contained within a higher level grouping, kind of indicating that they're all functional requirements versus non-functional. And the key is that I need to be able to prove traceability based on these groupings, traceability from those requirements to tests and to any other implementation details and defects, etc. Versus an example of reusability is more around, I have all of the accessibility requirements that the federal government requires. I want to have them defined in one place and then apply them to a whole bunch of different products or applications. And often in the reusability case, there's this need to have variants as well. So it's mostly these accessibility requirements, but with some things changed for different pieces. And so that's step one, is that you need to think through the core needs and the purpose for using a requirements management tool. But now comes the hard part, right? Because you've thought through the purpose, right? Great, you understand why you're doing this, and you've come up with a structure that makes sense based on that purpose. But how will that be represented in your Agile tool or in your test tool? And as I said before, there's many discussions on the actual flow of the artifacts, and that's a whole different topic. But of course, you recognize that the important thing is somehow that requirement that started in Jama or Blueprint or wherever gets into Jira. Oftentimes, the requirement flows over as like a feature or an epic, and then is broken down into stories on the Agile side. So it's not that part isn't equally as important, but today it's really my focus is on the notion of containment and aligning disparate containment structures. And so rather than talking in abstract terms, I think it's going to be easier to go through and use a real example. So the example I'm going to use is I'm going to talk a little bit about IBM Doors Next Generation. So every requirements management tool has kind of different paradigms and different affordances that are available to manage your requirements. So in Doors Next Gen, I'm going to read through these 6 bullets because it's important. Every requirement exists in one and only one folder. You can have a hierarchy of folders. Collections are essentially a view into requirements, and quite important, one requirement can exist in multiple collections. And then they have another containment type called modules, and those are essentially what I would call structured views. And one requirement can also exist in multiple modules. Although, if you talk to the experts on IBM Doors Next Gen, they recommend that you don't do that, but it is possible to do. So let's walk through a quick example. Let's set the stage. My business goal, my purpose is really around reusability, and my organization needs to ensure that any new web application that we build supports and adheres to all of the accessibility requirements that the federal government mandates. So I guess this isn't a pop quiz, but maybe I could try and make it a pop quiz. Will this work? So what you see on the screen in front of you is I've decided that I have Doors Next Gen for my requirements management on one side, and Jira on the other side. And I have, as you can see, one folder that has these 3 requirements in it. And then I've created a collection, 2 collections, one for each application that I need to make sure adheres to those requirements. And so these, as I noted before, one requirement can exist in multiple collections in the case of DNG. And what I want is for those requirements to flow one per project. So if you take a slightly more abstract view of this, the containment sync point is really collections to projects. Now, it's not to say that the other containers don't exist. Obviously, the purpose of in DNG of the top-level project area would likely be some type of top-level initiative to match it to SAFE. Then folders still allow for your functional groupings. And then what you do is you create a collection, kind of an instance of, for purposes of reusability. And then, of course, on the Jira side, the purpose of your project is your execution structure, the core execution structure. So going back to my original question, will this work? Well, you encounter two problems very quickly. The first one being changing requirements. So while it is true that you can have multiple requirements in the same requirement in multiple collections, let's pretend that I changed this requirement. So what will actually happen is that we'll actually end up changing it everywhere, including in the originating folder and in the other project, which is likely not what you wanted to have happen. It's possible that you did, but it's likely not what you wanted to have happen. So the second problem you encounter is around traceability. So in this case, my third requirement, I had 2 tests testing it for project 1, and I had a different set of tests for project 2. And what I would like to see is that structure replicated on the other side so that visibility is clear. And it's a little unclear what you would even want the requirement in the folder, how you want those relationships to manifest in the kind of base requirement. But what's actually going to happen is that everything is going to point to everything. And that's really definitely something that you have to consider when you think about containment, is how relationships are handled between artifacts within your container, which is a mouthful, which is certainly a mouthful to say. So, okay, bummer. So, okay, let's try something different. So in this case, what I want you to notice is it may appear similar, but it's actually got modules here, not collections. So same on the Jira side. And by the way, I don't have time to walk through, all the possible ways to do this, but I'm giving an example changing just things on the Doors Next Gen side. I could also change things on the Jira side in terms of the structure. But in this case, let's see if this one will work. Let's give it a go. So again, now instead of collections, the containment sync point is between modules and projects. So what's going to happen with my changing requirements? Well, unfortunately, you're going to have the same problem. If you change the requirement in one place, it's going to change everywhere. There are probably some of you, I suspect, going, wait. Just make it where you only have one direction of flow, just from DNG to Jira. And that can help a little bit, but you'll still run into the problem that if I change it here or here, it's going to change it here as well, which will flow over to Jira, which again might be what you want, but oftentimes is not what you want because you actually wanted some nuance to the differences between the different applications. So let's look at problem number 2. Again, if you remember, what I wanted to have happen is I just wanted these 2 tests for project 1 and these tests for project 2. This is what I wanted. And in fact, in this case, using this container, the module container, this will work. And this is what you'll get because modules don't share. If you put a requirement into a module in Doors Next Gen, the relationships that you create are not shared. That said, it's still a bit tricky to know. The originating requirement will have all of the tests related to it. So I think the main purpose, I think hopefully that example gives you a really clear sense of why it is that you need to think through the purpose and understand the nuances of the containers that exist and how artifacts are treated within those containers. So I'm not going to go through another example, but think about what the equivalent would look like if you were using JAMA instead of Doors Next Gen, or if you were using HP ALM instead of Jira. Their containers and purposes are different, and so you'll have to consider that. So as an example, in JAMA, one requirement can only live in one container, and so that then kind of fundamentally changes how you would approach understanding what you want to flow or how you want to flow it. So But it's not just about organizing. It's also about scheduling, right? As we said, remember back in the pop quiz, Agile tools do have a lot of scheduling containers. And as you can see here from this picture, requirements management tools tend to not. And this is probably the thing that I've seen the most. You basically have two choices. And often people default to the first choice, which is to use an organizing container to be a scheduling container. And I look forward to engaging in some conversations around this. But to date, I have not seen great success doing that. And it's really because there's three issues. First off, maintenance. Agile tools, these scheduling containers get created automatically, and they're kind of easy to maintain, but because they kind of don't at their core exist in requirements management tools, keeping them accurate and up to date is difficult. Another issue is the dynamic movement. As you all know, in Agile, things move quite a bit between sprints, between different backlogs, and that's very difficult to then have that reflected accurately in a requirements management tool, because that isn't at the core what the requirements management tool is trying to accommodate. And then issue 3 is that you've actually lost your organizing alignment, which as we saw in the example before is a pretty important piece if you're trying to, for instance, accomplish reusability. So your other choice, and what I believe is the better choice, is to flow the sprint and release information, kind of the scheduling information, as attributes of the actual requirement within a container. And so at that point, what you essentially do is you have a custom field on a requirement that represents sprint or release or both, and that is fed from the Agile tool. And that way the business analysts are getting visibility into that information, but it's not actually using a container. It's not actually using a container to do that. But wait, there's more. There's definitely more considerations. What about baselines and reviews? Well, I don't have time to talk about all of those today, but definitely know that they play a significant role in your success. And hopefully this conversation has kind of opened your eyes to the fact that this notion of the containers that you have and paying attention to that containment structure is a really important part to having a successful SAFe implementation. So in summary, you really need to think through your flow strategy to successfully implement SAFe in an environment that requires requirements management. That sounded funny, didn't it? It requires requirements management. And you must really understand containers to be successful at this. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's tool-specific and organization-specific, really, because every tool has these different containers for different purposes. And probably the most important thing is that every tool has pretty significant amount of nuances between them that are really important to understand. So before I open it up to questions, I did want to just walk through some tips and tricks of things that we've learned from our customers and from our experience doing this multiple times. So first, understand what each container type is intended to be for. Understand if an artifact can be in more than one container. And probably the most important thing is the third bullet, because if it can be in more than one container, understand whether a change made to any instance of that artifact will change in the rest of them. And of course, those of you on the call that are IBM customers and familiar with the configuration management functionality that IBM has come out with, that makes it even more complex. It's very important to consider how relationships are handled, because relationships in tools are often kind of handled differently than just core attributes of artifacts. And so you need to understand what relationships are available and how they will flow. And then, as I mentioned earlier, represent the notion of release and sprints as attributes or fields. Don't take an organizing container like a collection and have it and mask itself as a scheduling container. A few more tips and tricks. Often using one-way flow is the best choice for requirements, right? The requirement system is often considered the single source of the truth, and so you can remove some unintentional consequences by just flowing things one way. Although I do always like to make sure to say to people that if you're going to do that, the best way to handle it on the tool that you don't want them to make edits to is to ensure that permissions are set on that tool such that they can't make changes. You can obviously say when you define your integration that you only want it to flow one way, but if people then make changes anyway and it's not flowing back, that can cause even more confusion. Recognize that the way you want to flow requirements to an Agile test management tool might be different than how you want to flow it to an Agile development tool. And that's important to think through those two different use cases that you're trying to accomplish. This one is very important. Start small and experiment. Don't try and boil the ocean and define this amazing containment structure alignment and then pull the plug. Try a couple small experiments first. That will go a long way. And this last bullet is probably the most important one, is to really talk to the business analysts and developers and really understand how they do their work and why they have things structured the way they do. It's easy to kind of come in and say, you know what, we're going to change everything, here's how I want it to work. But honestly, there's usually very good reasons why things are structured the way they are. And taking the time to kind of, I don't know, to bring it back to marriage, to do the marriage counseling between the business analysts and developers and understand why and how, and I should say testers as well, why and how they're doing why they're doing things the way they are can really enable a more successful solution. So we really want to hear from you. I hope that this brief chat has kind of opened your eyes and brains to this notion of the importance of containment. And I really feel like in all the years I've been doing this, there's not enough conversation around the importance of containment. And so it kind of as part of our Summer of Agile, we really want to start a conversation around this. I look forward to, and I'm not actually even kidding, I would happily meet people at the Container Bar in Austin to talk about containment. And I look forward to engaging. We're going to be sending out a survey that I would love to hear back from people on. And if there's any other questions, obviously now I'm happy to open it up to questions from anyone who's on the webinar or after the fact as well. So with that, Sarah, I'll hand it back to you.
Great. Thank you, Nicole. That was very informative, and I think I even followed along most of the way. So, and I think most of our attendees also followed along, but we did have a couple of questions. So,
cool.
Going back to the Doors Next Gen example that you gave, you had mentioned later on the configuration management. We had a question about whether that example was based on Doors Next Gen 5, which has the configuration management, product line engineering.
Yeah, it was not based on that. It's a whole different ballgame. My picture would look pretty different if it involved configuration management. And what's really interesting about that is that, talk about fundamental disconnect. What do you do if you have configuration management on one side, like Doors Next Gen, and you don't have it on the other side? Like Jira. It's a different ballgame and something that that we're actually spending a lot of time thinking about right now because it's not really all that trivial to figure out the best way to flow in that case, especially with that when you don't have configuration management on both sides. So no, that example was based on pre-configuration management.
Right. Thank you. We have another person who wrote in and said, so we've been using our requirements management tool for a long time, and you know, everybody's pretty entrenched in how they're using it. Do you think we can actually change how they use containers, you know, based on your wonderful advice? So I know you touched a little bit on, you know, listen to why they're using them the way they are. But if you could elaborate a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, so it's not easy to solve that, but what I have noticed is that if you help the practitioners, the business analysts, understand why it will benefit them, it goes a long way to helping them understand that maybe some changes would be okay. For instance, oftentimes the big thing that business analysts want is to understand test coverage status, right? They want to know if their requirements have been tested and if those tests are passing. And so if you say, listen, if you're willing to work with me on maybe making a little bit of change to your containment structure, you'll get this benefit, and I think that can help. But truth be told, as with all change is difficult for people and takes time, which is another reason why I encourage people to start small,
right?
Not big.
So let's see. Is there a scenario that you've encountered where it wasn't possible to define a way to sync the information back and forth?
No, although I'll be honest, the configuration management one worries me, but no, not so far. We've been able to solve things, but it does sometimes, we have had to use things that are, it's kind of odd. It's not, I wouldn't exactly call them containers. Like sometimes we've had to use the notion of views and filters to group things sort of in a different way to make it flow, to make the flow make sense. Mm-hmm. So we've always been able to solve it, but it sometimes does take a little bit of trial and error, I guess I would say, as well.
Right. So let's see. I'm trying to make sure that we get everyone's questions answered. This one's kind of a big one, but I'm going to let you take a crack at it. So we have, I work in a big utility company, which is rolling out Agile, Safe, and Rational. Do you think a hybrid project management methodology is the answer? Get business requirements in waterfall mode, enter them into RRC, which is our requirements management module. And then, sorry, I lost my place in the question. And then copy the requirements into RTC as the product backlog items that to be decomposed into user stories.
So the way I would answer that is honestly, I mean, even TaskTop is not a large utility, and even we have found greater success by having a requirements management, it's not really a requirements management tool, but separating out the defining part from the doing part. And especially if you're using both IBM tools, they're very much set up for exactly that purpose, right? To go ahead and define them in Doors NextGen or RRC, and then execute them in Rational. The thing that I found most valuable, and I'm sure that there's going to be some people on this webinar that are like, oh my God, this lady is crazy. That's completely not okay. What I've noticed, which is not maybe the purest Agile view of the world, but if you let the business analysts define the requirements and kind of think of those as kind of features or epics, and you kind of leave requirements at that, and then let the developers, in your case RTC, break them down into the user stories, meaning the developers kind of own the user story view of the world, and the kind of crossover point is a requirement as a feature or an epic. I've seen a lot of success with that, and I think part of that is because everyone has a bit of sense of ownership involved. Developers, as you guys know, do not like to be told how to break down their work, but business analysts obviously are the ones that understand that things have to kind of be grouped in a certain way. So yeah, I think that I do think it can work.
Thank you. So we did have one question about how TaskTop can help manage across containers. If the sync can be done only to containers and not to the base artifacts, or how that works.
Right. So just to be clear, in terms of what TaskTop does, is the containment, aligning the containment is about aligning, figuring out what artifacts, the actual requirements in this case, or whatever you're wanting to flow, how you define what you want to flow. The thing that actually flows is, in fact, the requirement. And so TaskTop essentially can sit in the middle, and you define the fact that you're going to use collections and they're going to flow over as a project in Jira, and then any requirements that you put into that collection will automatically flow. Will automatically flow over to Jira. So TaskTop is actually the actual thing that flows is the artifact, the requirement, or the defect.
Right.
But the containment structure is important so that you know what is going to flow.
Great, thank you. And I know we are running up against, or even over the time that you have with us today, Nicole. So I think we're not going to be able to get to everyone's questions today, but luckily there will be a follow-up webinar, and we will try to reach out to you before that as well to try to answer all of the questions that we couldn't answer live today. So I wanted to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank Nicole for the wonderful presentation. As you see up there on the screen, if you have any other questions, you can go to go.tasktop.com/contact us, and we have a little form there, and you can fill it out, and we will get right back to you. So if that is all from you, Nicole, I think that would be the end of the webinar.
Thanks everyone for their time. I greatly appreciate it, and think about containers. I can't wait to hear from people about containers.
Great, thank you so much.